Hello and welcome to Coffee with Dr. Carla. I'm Dr. Carla. This is Michaela. We're glad that you're here with us today. Our goal today is to talk about some mental health related issues and hopefully end the stigma surrounding them. So today's topic is a doozy. We're going to talk about childhood trauma, and more importantly, what happens when there was trauma in your childhood when suddenly you become adult. How does that show up as an adult? So, I don't know. There's so many good places we can start. Where do you want to start with that one today?
Um, my first thought when you say that is how trauma, the definition of trauma is different for everyone and how it can show up differently for everyone because of that.
Sure.
And some people may not even realize different traumas are trauma, or they may not count them as traumas to begin with.
Right. Right. I know that there's been times where we've talked about where you're doing an intake and you say, "Hey, so how was your childhood?" It was normal,
Mhm.
and then you'd say, "Okay, well, tell me a couple things about your dad." Well, he was an alcoholic and he used to beat us, and
Mhm.
you're like, "Yeah, that's not normal."
Mhm.
They're like, "Yeah, everybody on the street was like that. That's
Mhm.
exactly it was normal, right?" So, right, like
Mhm.
this idea of normalizing abuse,
Mhm.
um, scary.
Yes, especially when it shows up in their adult world. So they're okay with receiving that same type of abuse from their friends, from their family continuing, from relationships, from jobs, and they don't have those boundaries because they were never created.
Right. I know there's been times where I've had clients come in and they'll say things like, "Yeah, I had a rough childhood, um, and I'm having a hard time, you know, coping now
Mm-hmm.
and whatnot." And then we'll do some work, and then they'll say, "Yeah, there definitely was abuse in my childhood," and then we do some more work, and then maybe one day I'll say, "Well." And then maybe they'll ask me something like, "Well, why do you think I'm acting like this?" And I might say, "Well, from when you were abused when you were younger." Wait, you think I'm abused? Right? Like, so
Mm-hmm.
it's so interesting, that dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
because I've had clients talk about being abused, like using the word. And then
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden, at one point, when I say it back to them, they're shocked. They're angry. They're
Mm-hmm.
they're they're overwhelmed. They're dismayed, right? Like, wait a second, like they just finally realized that, you know, this was real, or
Mm-hmm.
or something. Because I've had it happen more than once.
Mm-hmm.
Like one time, then I'm like, okay, that's strange, but I've had it happen a fair number of
Mm-hmm.
times where um, it's really the client almost goes into shock.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
And then when you talk about abuse, I feel like there's different definitions of it because sometimes being whooped is normalized, and that can definitely constitute as being abuse to some people
sure.
rather than different other things. So that can constitute as abuse. So that also the definition of abuse with the trauma is conflicting as well because
So
of
when
that.
so when you're working with people,
Mhm.
from what perspective do you typically like how do you typically identify abuse? Like if you're working with somebody, what is your working definition, or how might you describe it to somebody?
So if I'm describing it to someone, I would say anything that has left maybe a post-traumatic response. And that response could be bodily, typically physically.
Right.
Um, the body doesn't lie.
No, it
And how
does
you
not.
respond to things physically is typically how you kind of realize the trauma you've been through, more so, to say the least, rather than discussing it and realizing it with your words. But I sometimes allow the clients to also begin to identify how the definition is for them.
Okay.
And that kind of talking it out and over time and realizing that their bodily responses to it and the definition um constitutes as abuse for them, but utilizing the word, as you said, it kind of triggers them to like, oh, my dad punched me or my dad used to whoop me unconscious all the time, but it wasn't abuse though, because that's just too far.
Right.
So yeah, I think allowing them to kind of make the connections through their own words and how they respond to things now and as adults.
Right. 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 Um, and I wonder, um, so I'm curious. So, like, how did what is it about this topic that has kind of drawn you in? Like, how has this topic become something that's of interest to you?
Because people don't realize how it affects them now. From my personal experience, I didn't really have the physical abuse aspect, but I like witnessed like emotional abuse. And I didn't realize how I shut down today
Okay.
because of that. And it wasn't necessarily towards me, it was just like I was around it. So it's like
Exposure.
yes, exposure, and that also counts.
Yes.
Exposure to it and being around it, constant yelling and screaming and all of that stuff. So in those environments, I shut down. I will not talk. I will completely distance myself. I don't do well with people yelling at me. And at first I thought it was just like a defense mechanism, not really realizing that it kind of resulted from my childhood and being around yelling. Don't get me wrong, my family's loud all the time. We're just a loud family, but loud and yelling are two different things.
Sure. Sure.
So the
And intent
yelling,
and the tension and the
yes.
context of it definitely makes a difference.
Exactly. And then my physical response to it as well. So I didn't realize it until I was in college and we went somewhere and it was just arguing and fighting. And I completely, like, my body, like, my heart was racing. It wasn't even about me at all. My heart was racing. I was sweating. I was like having a panic attack. And I was like, oh my God, I'm like having a panic attack in the middle of this and it's not even about me. And I started to pay more attention to that and realize kind of what was happening and relating it back to what used to happen.
Okay. So you gave some really good examples of how it shows up at, like when you're an adult.
Mhm.
What are there other like signs or things that someone can look for or pay attention to so that they could perhaps realize, oh, I'm having like a not so typical response to something.
Mhm.
Maybe I should seek some help. Like, so, like, what other things might people look for besides the ones you've already described?
I feel like it truly depends on the response, the bodily response for the individual, because it can show up as a panic attack, as I stated before. It can show up as shutting down. It can show up as overthinking or over storytelling. I can't think of the word, but just excessive usage of different things. It can show up in a million ways. It just truly depends on the person and how that trauma affected them now and then.
And I'm sure substance abuse
Mhm.
definitely would be one. Different things that you're doing, numbing. Like when you talk about shutting down,
Mhm.
right? That's our way of protecting ourselves. But we also
Exactly.
like to numb. So we can numb by drinking
Mhm.
too much or, uh, you know, getting high
Mhm.
or overusing
Shopping,
shopping, being
sex.
too busy,
Mhm.
sex, gambling, spending,
Mhm.
food, all those lovely numbing
Mhm.
processes, right? So that's interesting. So, what's your recommendation if someone suspects that perhaps, you know, the current day struggles might be um, the result of past issues or traumas? What do you recommend to those folks?
Seek help. Seek help so you're able to kind of make the realization between like the cognitive aspect and the behavioral aspect of what's kind of happening for you. Um, I know, like talked about before, in the aspect of not seeking help, but it just is very helpful in being able to kind of have someone guide you in the direction to kind of link the two together to see how the behavior can change for the future.
Yeah. And then and if you find the right fit, then you could be fully supported. It'll
Mhm.
be a safe place to do that.
Yeah.
So, all right. I appreciate it. This is a tough subject for so
Mhm.
many people because it just brings up so many, difficult issues. So
Mhm.
I appreciate you having that conversation with me. So remember, you can change your thoughts, discover your potential, and transform your life by focusing on your overall well being. So until next time, continue working on being the best you possible. Bye.